Welcome back, everyone, to another week and another episode of Interventions and Detentions, the podcast. I'm your host, Brad, and today's episode is one that I've been thinking about for a while now, not because it's controversial, but because it's more complex and complicated. And more importantly, because it's something that I don't think gets talked about in a long-form, honest way nearly enough in education. We're at episode 2, 31, season 2, episode 31, and let's just call it support versus reality. It's my take, one principal's take, just one lowly elementary principal's take on educational influencers in social media. Before I go any further, I want to be very clear about what this episode is and what it is not. First off, this is not a personal attack on any one individual. It's not about tearing anyone down. It's not about questioning someone's intentions, and it's not about trying to call out a specific educator or influencer. This is a professional conversation about something bigger than one person. This episode is about how education is being represented on social media and how those representations, whether intended or not, are shaping expectations inside real schools just like mine and just like yours. Expectations between teachers and administrators, expectations from parents, and even expectations that we place on ourselves as leaders. Everything I'm talking about today is based on publicly available content and my own experience as a school leader. I'm not sharing private information. I'm not making claims about what happens behind the scenes, and I'm not asking anyone to agree with me, believe me. What I'm asking is for people to just stop and think, because leadership in schools is complex, and complexity does not translate well into short-form content. Now, if you've spent any amount of time on social media in the educational space, you've probably noticed a shift over the past several years. We've moved from using social media primarily to share ideas and resources to something a little different. We now have what I would call a full-blown ecosystem of educational influencers. Teachers, principals, consultants, speakers, people who have built large audiences by sharing content about what happens in schools. And again, I want to be clear, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. In fact, a lot of it's really positive. There are educators out there who are sharing creative ideas, who are bringing humor to a tough profession, who are helping people feel less alone in what can be a very isolating job. And that matters. But as that space has grown, something else has grown with it. Influence. Because when someone has tons and thousands and tens of thousands, or in some cases hundreds of thousands of followers, they're no longer just sharing their perspective. They're shaping how people think. They're shaping how teachers view administrators. They're shaping how administrators think they're supposed to lead. And in some cases, they're shaping how parents interpret what should be happening inside our schools. That's a lot of influence. And with that influence comes responsibility, whether someone is intentionally trying to take on that responsibility or not. Now, I want to bring in two examples here because I think they help illustrate the range of what we're seeing in this space. On one end, you have creators like, we'll just say Principal Lamb. His content focuses heavily on leadership, what administrators should be doing, how they should show up for teachers, how they should structure their day, how they should respond on certain situations. It's direct, it's confident, it's very clear in its messaging. And I understand why people are drawn to it, because it gives them a sense of certainty. It answers the question, what should good leadership look like? On the other hand, you have someone like, let's say, Gerry Brooks. Now, Gerry's content's very different in tone and purpose. He's not typically telling people how to lead. He's not laying out a blueprint for what administrators should or shouldn't do. Instead, he's more reflecting on the shared experiences of people in schools, often through humor, often through exaggeration, but rooted in truth that educators recognize immediately. And I think that distinction matters more than we might initially realize, because one approach is perspective and prescriptive. It tells you what you should be. And the other is more reflective. It shows you what is. And those two things land very differently within an audience. Now, here's where I want to be very intentional with what I say next. I actually agree with a lot of ideas that are shared in leadership-focused content online. Teachers should feel supported. Administrators should be visible. Leaders should be approachable. None of that's controversial, but agreeing with an idea is not the same as agreeing with how that idea is presented or how it's interpreted when it reaches a wide audience. Because what happens on social media is this: messages get simplified, nuance gets stripped away, and what's left is something that sounds clear, confident, and actionable, but not always complete. And that's not necessarily anyone's fault. That's just how the platform works. Short-form content rewards clarity. It rewards confidence. It rewards statements that feel definitive. But schools don't operate in definitive statements. They operate in trade-offs. Every decision that gets made in a school building affects multiple groups of people at the same time. When you support a teacher, you also have to consider the student. When you make a decision for a student, you have to consider the family. When you respond to a family, you have to consider the broader community. And when you try to balance all of that, there are going to be moments where no decision feels perfect. And that's leadership. That's the part of the job that doesn't fit into a 1-minute video. And when that part of the job isn't visible, it creates a gap. A gap between what leadership looks like online and what leadership actually feels like in the day-to-day practice. And that gap matters because when people consume enough simplified messaging, it starts to shape expectations. Teachers begin to expect a certain type of support in every situation. Administrators begin to feel like they're falling short if they can't replicate what they're seeing online. And over time, that disconnect can start to impact relationships. Not because anyone's trying to cause harm, but because the full picture isn't being shown. And that's what really is what I want to unpack in this episode. It's really what I want to break down. Not whether someone's right or wrong. That's not the question. But whether the way we're talking about leadership online is really helping in schools, or is it quietly making the work more difficult? As we move further into this conversation, I want to spend some time sitting in with the contrast between different types of educational content creators, because I think that's where this really starts to come into focus. Not all influence in this space is the same. Not all messaging lands the same. And not all content creates the same kind of impact inside real schools. If you look at someone like Gerry Brooks, his presence online is massive. He's built a following over years by leaning into humor, storytelling, and shared experiences. His videos often highlight things that teachers and administrators instantly recognize and can relate to. Staff meetings that go too long, buzzwords that get overused, moments that feel all too familiar in a school setting. What makes his content work is that it doesn't position him as having all the answers. He's not telling you, this is how you should lead. He's saying, you've seen this too, right? You've been there. And that creates connection without creating pressure. Now, on the other side of that, you have someone like Principal Lamb, who has built a significant following by focusing on leadership practices, particularly around how administrators should support teachers, how they should structure their day, and how they should interact with staff. His content is much more perspective, in my opinion. It often comes across as, here's what good leadership looks like, or here's what administrators should be doing. And again, I want to be very clear here. I'm not saying that the idea themselves are wrong. In fact, many of them are rooted in things that we would all agree with. Yep, visibility matters. Relationships do matter. Supporting teachers definitely matters. But the way those ideas are delivered, and more importantly, the way they are received, can create a very different kind of impact. Let's talk about Let's talk about each for a moment because this is where things get real. When you start looking and talking about creators with tens or hundreds of thousands of followers across platforms like TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, you're no longer talking about casual sharing. You're talking about influence at a scale. And influence at a scale changes the way messages land. Because when a message reaches a handful of people, it gets filtered through context. When it reaches hundreds of thousands of people, the context gets lost. People don't just hear what's being said, they interpret it through their own experiences. A teacher who feels unsupported may hear a video about what administrators should do and interpret it as confirmation that their own leadership is falling short. An administrator who is working hard to balance multiple competing demands may hear that same message and feel like they're being reduced to a stereotype. And neither of those reactions is necessarily what the creator intended, but intention doesn't control interpretation. And interpretation is what drives the impact. Now, here's something else that's important to understand about social media. Content that is clear, confident, and directive tends to spread faster than content that is reflective or nuanced, because it gives people something to latch onto. If someone says leadership's complicated and there are a lot of variables to consider, that's true, but it doesn't go viral. If someone says, if you're not doing this, you're not supporting your teachers, that's going to get attention. It's going to get engagement and it's going to get shared. Not necessarily because it's more accurate, but because it's more definitive. And definitive messaging creates strong reactions. Those reactions drive algorithms, and those algorithms push the messaging even further. So what you end up with is a feedback loop. Clear, simplified messaging spreads. That messaging shapes expectations, and those expectations influence how people interpret their own experiences. And then those interpretations drive further engagement with similar content. Over time, that loop can start to shape how people believe schools should operate. And again, I want to pause here and ground this in reality. There are absolutely administrators out there who need to be more present. There are leaders who need to listen more. There are systems that we need to improve. That's not up for debate. But the idea that there's a single, visible, repeatable set of actions that defines good leadership in every context, that's where things really start to break down, because schools are not identical environments. They are incredibly complex ecosystems. You have different student populations, different community expectations, different staffing structures, different levels of support, different challenges. And leadership within those environments requires constant adjustment. It requires judgment. It requires, at times, making decisions that won't be popular with everyone involved. And that's the part that doesn't translate well online, because it's not clean and it's not clear and it's not simple. It doesn't fit into a format where you can say, here's the right answer. Now, I want to talk specifically about how this begins to affect relationships inside a school, because that's where I believe the real impact shows up. When teachers consistently see messaging that emphasizes what administrators should be doing, especially when it's framed in a way that feels absolute, it can start to shift expectations. It can create a sense of, this is what support should look like in every situation. And when reality doesn't match that expectation, it can lead to frustration. Even if the administrator is working hard, even if they are making thoughtful decisions, even if they are trying to balance multiple perspectives. Because from the outside, it can look like they're just not doing what they're supposed to do. At the same time, administrators are consuming this content too. And for many, it creates a different kind of pressure, a sense that they're supposed to be constantly visible, constantly available, constantly responsive in ways that may not always be sustainable. And when they can't maintain that because the jobs include responsibilities that aren't visible, it can feel like they're falling short. There's a tough place to operate from right there. Because now both sides, teachers and administrators, are working with expectations that may not fully align with reality. And again, this isn't about blame. This is about understanding how messaging influences perception. Now, let's bring this back to the contrast that we talked about earlier. When you watch someone like Gerry Brooks, you're not walking away with a checklist. You're walking away with a sense of, okay, I'm not the only one who sees this. There's a shared understanding there. It builds connection without prescribing a behavior. But when you watch more directive content that tells you what leadership should look like, it invites evaluation and comparison. It invites people to look at their own situation and measure it against what they're seeing. And that measurement can be helpful in some cases, but it can also be misleading if the context isn't the same. Because what works in one environment may not work in another. And when those differences are acknowledged, it creates a false sense of universality. That's where I believe we need to be really careful, not because people should not share ideas. We want that. But because of the way the ideas are framed, that's what really matters. The difference between saying, here's something that has worked in my context, and saying, this is what good leadership looks like, is really, really significant. One invites discussion, the other sets a standard. And when that standard is built in on incomplete context, it can create tension where there doesn't need to be any at all. I want to transition into something that I think is really important for this whole conversation. Because up to this point, we've talked about influence, messaging, and perception, but what we haven't fully unpacked is the impact. And that's where I want to go next, because this doesn't just live online. This shows up in real conversations, real expectations, and real relationships right here inside school buildings. And if we're going to talk honestly about leadership, we have to be willing to talk about that part too. I want to build on what we've been talking about to take that step further, because understanding influence is one thing, but understanding the impact is where this really, really starts to matter. And to do that, I want to bring in a perspective that hasn't been shared by others inside of the educational space, specifically from a blog written by an organization called Real Schools. Now, I'm not bringing this in as this is the right take or this is the definitive opinion, but I do think it raises some important points that are worth considering as part of a broader conversation. The blog itself takes a critical stance towards leadership content on social media, particularly content that simplifies complex situations or presents leadership as a series of clear, repeatable actions. And one of the central arguments that really makes sense is this: when leadership is reduced to short, polished messaging, it can unintentionally strip away the complexity that actually defines the role. And that's something I want to sit with you for just a moment. Let that sit. Because if you think about what leadership really looks like in a school setting, it's really rarely clean. It's not obvious, and it's almost never something that can be captured fully in a quick 1-minute clip. You're dealing with human beings, such as students, teachers, families, all with different needs, all with different perspectives, and sometimes competing interests. And leadership in that environment is less about following a script and more about navigating tension. Now, the blog also raises another point that I think is worth exploring, and that's the idea that some of the content can be structured in a way that prioritizes engagement over nuance. And again, I want to be careful here because I'm not saying that's the intent. But I am saying that the platform itself rewards the outcome. Because when content is framed in a way that feels bold or definitive, it tends to get more attention. It gets more likes and more shares and more comments. And over time, that kind of framing becomes the norm. So instead of seeing the conversations that sound like, here's a situation, here are the variables, here's how we worked through it, we start seeing messaging that sounds more like, this is what should happen. And that shift matters because when something is presented as what should happen, it creates a standard. And when people start measuring their own experiences against that standard, it can lead to frustration if things don't align. I want to connect this back to something that we've talked about earlier, relationships inside a school, because this is where I think the unintended impact really starts to show up. When teachers consistently engage with content that emphasizes how administrators should act, it can begin to shape expectations in subtle ways. It can create a mental mode of what support is supposed to look like. And again, some of that can be positive. Teachers should expect support. Teachers should feel valued, and teachers should feel heard. But when those expectations become absolute, when they shift from this is something that should be helpful or would be helpful to this is what must always happen, that's where things get complicated because leadership decisions are rarely absolute. There are times when supporting a teacher means having a difficult conversation. There are times when supporting a student may not align perfectly with what a teacher wants in that moment. There are times when a parent's perspective has to be considered even when it creates tension. And those are the moments that define true leadership. Not the easy ones, not the visible ones, the difficult, often uncomfortable ones. And those moments don't translate well on social media because they don't come with clear heroes and villains. They don't come with simple resolutions. They come with trade-offs, and that's about it. And from the administrative side, there's another layer to all of this because administrators are also consuming this content. And for many, it creates a sense of pressure, a feeling that they're supposed to show up in certain ways at times. They're supposed to be constantly visible, constantly available, constantly aligned with the kind of leadership that's being promoted online. And here's the reality, folks. That's not always sustainable. Not because administrators don't want to support their staff. That's not it. It's not sustainable because the role includes responsibilities that aren't visible. There are meetings that happen behind closed doors. There's conversations with families that require time and care. There's legal considerations. There are district expectations. There are moments where you have to gather information before you act. And none of that shows up in a short video. So when the visible part of leadership becomes the primary measure of effectiveness, it creates a skewed perception of the role. It elevates what can be seen and minimizes what cannot. And over time, that can lead to misunderstandings. I want to talk about something that can be uncomfortable to say, but I think it's important. There's a difference between supporting teachers and always agreeing with teachers. And I think sometimes those two ideas get blurred online through the messaging and the content. Supporting teachers means being an advocate for them, listening to them, providing resources for them, and creating an environment where they can be successful. But it also means being honest, and it means addressing concerns when they arise. It means making decisions that consider the entire school community, even when those decisions are difficult. And that balance is not always visible from the outside. Because from the outside, it's easy to interpret decisions without seeing the full context. It's easy to say, why didn't that administrator do this? Or why didn't they respond this way? But those questions are often based on partial information. And when social media reinforces a simplified version of how decisions should be made, it can amplify that gap between perception and reality. Going back to the blog from Real Schools for a minute, one of the concerns raised is that kind of messaging can become divisive. Not intentionally, but as a byproduct of how it's framed. Because when leadership is presented in a way that implies a clear right and wrong approach, it can create an us versus them dynamic. Teachers versus administrators. Good leaders versus ineffective leaders. And that kind of framing doesn't help anyone. Schools don't function well when those lines are drawn. They function well when there's trust, when there's communication, and a shared understanding of the work. I want to be very, very clear about something. None of this means that we shouldn't talk about improving leadership. None of this means that administrators shouldn't reflect on their practices. It doesn't mean that teachers shouldn't advocate for better support. Those conversations are necessary. but they need to be grounded in reality. They need to be acknowledged through the complexity, and they need to leave room for context. Because without that, we risk creating a version of leadership that sounds good but doesn't hold up in practice. And that's where I want to bring in my own perspective for a moment, because I've been in situations where decisions had to be made that weren't going to make everyone happy. I've been in conversations where supporting one person meant disappointing the other. I've had moments where the best decision long term didn't look like the best decision in the moment. And I can tell you this, those are the moments that define a person's leadership. Not the ones that get posted and not the ones that get shared. It's the ones that happen quietly behind the scenes when you're trying to do what's right with the information that you have at the moment. And that's part of the job, the part of the job that I think really gets lost when leadership is reduced to a 1-minute clip of content. Content highlights moments, but leadership, true leadership, is built on consistency over time. It's built on trust. It's built on relationships that develop through both good moments and difficult ones. And when we lose sight of that, we start to measure leadership based on snapshots instead of substance. So as we move into the final part of this episode, I want to shift the focus just slightly, because we've talked about the challenges and we talked about the impact. Now, let's talk about what this could look like moving forward, because the goal here isn't to criticize. I'm going to reinforce that again. I'm not here to criticize, bash, or anything. The goal is to improve the conversation. That's all we want to do. As we move into this final part of the episode, I want to shift the focus forward. Because at the end of the day, folks, this isn't about pointing out problems just for the sake of pointing them out. It's about improving the conversation and the content. It's about asking what this space, education on social media, could look like if we were more intentional about how we use it. Because the reality is, education and influencers aren't going anywhere. The space is only going to continue to grow. I mean, I'm hoping to be one myself doing this podcast. More teachers will share their experiences. More administrators will build their platforms, just like me. More voices will enter the conversation, and that can be a really, really good thing. But only if we're honest about the responsibility that comes with that kind of influence. Because when people are listening, really listening, you're not just sharing ideas anymore. You're shaping expectations. You're shaping how people interpret their daily experiences. You're also shaping how they view the people that they work with. And that really is what matters the most. So the question becomes, what does responsible messaging actually look like in this space? What does it look like to have influence and still respect that boundary of complexity of the work? And I think it starts with something simple, but not maybe necessarily easy. It starts with acknowledging the context. Instead of saying, this is what good leadership looks like, it becomes, this is something that has worked in my setting. That small shift really, really matters, because it invites conversation instead of comparison. It allows people to reflect instead of measure. And it recognizes that what works in one building may not translate directly to another. Another piece of this is being willing to show the full picture. Not just the moments that are clear and clean, but the moments that are complicated. The moments where there isn't a perfect answer. The moment where leadership requires navigating tension instead of resolving it. Because those are the moments that people need to understand if we're going to have honest conversation about this work. I understand why that doesn't happen often. It's harder to package, it's harder to share, and it doesn't always perform well. Maybe that's why I'm not getting a whole lot of momentum on my podcast, because I'm just keeping it real, folks. But just because something doesn't perform well doesn't mean it isn't valuable. And I think that's something that we have to wrestle with through this process. Because if the goal is influence, then performance truly matters. But if the goal is impact, then accuracy matters even more. And those two things are not always aligned. I also want to talk about tone for just a minute, because tone plays a huge role in how messaging is received. When content is framed in a way that feels absolute, when it uses language like always or never or this is what good leaders do, it can create a sense of certainty. But it also creates that division because it leaves very little room for alternative perspectives. It leaves very little room for context. And it can unintentionally position people who don't align with that messaging as being on the wrong side of the conversation. And that's not where we want to be. Because in education, we need more collaboration, not less. We need more understanding, not more division. And the way we communicate online can either support that or work totally against it. I want to bring this back to something very practical for a moment, because if you're listening to this as a teacher or as an administrator or maybe just someone working in schools, you're probably thinking about your own experience at this point. You're probably thinking about moments where something you saw online or heard online really resonated with you or it didn't. And I think it's important to approach that content with a level of awareness, to ask yourself a few questions like, what context might be missing here? What variables might not be shown? How might this look different in my own setting? Because when we start asking those questions, we move from consuming content passively to engaging with it critically. And that's where growth happens. I also want to say this clearly. There's value in being challenged. There's a value in seeing ideas that push you to reflect on your own practice. This isn't about dismissing everything that's shared online. It's about engaging with it in a way that's thoughtful and grounded, folks, because that's the goal. And the goal isn't to avoid influence. The goal is to understand it and to use it in a way that actually benefits people that we serve. As we kind of bring this to a close and try to wrap it up, I want to shift into what I would consider my own perspective on leadership, because I think it's important to not just critique, but to offer something in return. For me, leadership has always come back to one simple thing: balance. Not balance in the sense of keeping everyone happy. That's not realistic as much as we want to do that. It just doesn't happen. It's more about a balance in the sense of considering all the perspectives. The teacher perspective, the student perspective, parents and community, and understanding that each decision is going to land differently depending on where someone is sitting. There's going to be moments where supporting a teacher is the right call. There's going to be moments where supporting a student requires a different approach. There's going to be moments where a parent's perspective has to be taken seriously, even when it's difficult or you may not agree. And leadership's about navigating all those moments with one simple thing: integrity. Not perfection, not visibility, integrity. Doing the right thing with the information you have. Being willing to adjust when new information comes in. And being honest in your communication. Being consistent over time. Because at the end of the day, that's what builds trust. Not a single moment, not a single decision, consistency. Now that kind of leadership doesn't always look impressive from the outside. It doesn't always make for great content either. It doesn't always get attention, but it works and it builds relationships and it creates stability. It supports people in a way that's sustainable. And to me, that's what matters. Let's go back briefly to where we started with the idea of influence. Because influence in itself is not the problem. It's a tool. And like any tool, it can be used in different ways. It can be used to simplify, or it can be used to deepen understanding. It can be used to divide, or it can be used to connect. And I think as this space continues to grow, all we have to do is look at that role and what it plays in shaping how it develops. Whether you're creating content or consuming it, or maybe even just sharing it, you're still part of that ecosystem. And the more intentional we are about how we engage with it, the better it becomes. So as you leave this episode, I'm not asking you to stop watching or listening. I'm not asking you to stop following. I'm not asking you to stop engaging with educational content online. What I'm asking is that you think about it a little differently after today, that you recognize the difference between a moment and a full picture, that you recognize the difference between an idea and a reality, and that you give yourself and the people that you work with the space to operate in that reality, because schools are not simple. Leadership is not simple, and the more we try to make it simple, the more we risk missing what actually matters. And what actually matters is this: relationships, trust, consistency, and the willingness to do the work even when it doesn't fit into a format that's easy to share. That's leadership, and that's real work. And that's the conversation I hope we continue to have. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Thanks for always listening. And I want you to continue to share your thoughts and ideas about the content of my podcast, maybe ideas that you want to see or hear me talk about and bring up. If you want to be a guest, shoot me a message, leave me a comment. I'm always looking to make my content a little more diverse and reach more people out there. I hope you enjoy tuning in each week to Interventions and Attentions. Every Friday morning at 8 o'clock is when we try to get episodes out. Last week I was like 12 hours late. It was 8 p.m. because I forgot to hit the publish button. That's what happens. Real leaders get real busy sometimes. So this will be set to go out tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Today's Thursday. We just want you to continue tuning in, supporting the show, and give us some feedback, honest feedback, good or bad. We'll take it and we'll go with it. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Interventions and Attentions. I'm your host, Brad. Remember, Interventions and Attentions, it's where the real learning begins. See you next week.